afternoon, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the end of our full week of classes. I'm going to have one more lecture to post tomorrow, and then that's going to be the end of the material that will be eligible to be on our final exam, which will be a take-home exam. I'll be sending out an email with more details on that. So I hope you're doing well, making it through. It's been a crazy semester, but I hope we're learning some things from the semester that we can use moving forward. So this is our second lecture talking about climate change, and we're going to talk mostly about climate change impacts on species. But there's a whole field of, how do we solve these issues with climate change, and we'll talk about it when we talk about energy. But basically, there's really two pieces. There's putting less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and then there's being able to take more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has kind of given us this threshold of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius that we really want to keep from warming the planet up to. And one of the ways they've said we can do that is to increase the amount of forests. So the question comes up of where to put these forests. But it's very interesting that one of the areas that has been suggested are temperate forests in the eastern United States, for instance, where we are in the Appalachians. And so a lot of this land has been degraded by strip mining operations, we'll talk about again in our final lecture. But suffice to say, we can reforest these areas, and it's fairly hopeful. Since 2004, there have been over 100 million trees planted on these mined areas in Appalachia. So getting more trees on the land is going to be a real important piece of being able to mitigate climate change. And here in the Appalachians, we have a chance to contribute to that. So, again, I think in the U.S. sometimes climate change gets politicized and we get away from the data. But in lots of societies where indigenous folks are reliant on natural cycles, you really have to know what's going on with the climate, and you realize it when things are different. So in this particular study, these researchers asked villagers in Nepal about the climate. They asked about precipitation, temperature, things like that. And it's really interesting. So essentially, these villagers were telling the researchers what the temperature data had already told them, that they were aware of these temperature changes and that this is affecting the way that they were living. So in general, folks said that the climate was warming, that precipitation patterns were changing, water sources drying up. There was a perception of changes in phenology, that's the timing of events in plant and animal life cycles, and that it seemed to be most extreme at higher elevations. And again, those are the exact same trends that the climate data are telling us. So it's important to realize that while in the U.S. we might say that climate change is we might question the evidence for it when we shouldn't. In other places where people are reliant on the climate for their livelihood, as are the agricultural, the agrarian societies in Nepal, then people already know kind of what's going on. So again, this is essentially just the follow-up to that and how things have been happening. The mean temperature has increased by about 1.5 degrees in Nepal. There's been more rain in the monsoon, less in the winter, and there's been a change in the start and the length of the growing season by almost 5 days. Okay, so how have plants and animals been responding to climate change? Let's take a look at that. So there's an article published 17 years ago at this point that argued that we now have a coherent global fingerprint of climate change impacts across natural systems. So essentially at this point we could look at ecosystems and say things are different than they've been before. So what does this look like? Well, one of the authors undertook a study examining butterfly species. So They looked at 35 non-migratory species in Europe and examined what they've been doing with their ranges, the area of land that they occupy. So the good news is this was done in Great Britain, and Great Britain has a history of citizen science. That is, people who study and keep data on butterflies just because they enjoy it. So there's a wonderful historical data set on where butterflies occurred that people can go back and look at and ask questions about how have the ranges changed over the last century. So it turned out that when these authors looked at those data, almost 2/3 of those species have shifted their ranges to the north, but only 3% have shifted to the south. Now, species are never static, and our ability to find them is certainly not 100%. But if there was no bias in the direction these species were moving, we would expect that the percentage of species shifting to the north would equal the percentage of species shifting to the south. Instead, these authors found a strong bias to the north, which again, since we're in the northern hemisphere here, is poleward toward cooler temperatures. Well, here in western North Carolina, we have a history of climate-induced migration. So this is what the ice sheets looked like at the last ice age. Remember, these ice ages were driven by the Milankovitch cycles, these cyclical variations in the shape of the Earth's orbit. So in the Pleistocene, right, the last glacial maximum about 15,000 years ago, we had sheets of ice that came down right down to the border of Kentucky is how close they got to us. But as you can imagine, as those ice sheets moved north as the temperature warmed, species migrated as well, right? Because if they were cool temperature species, all of a sudden places like North Carolina and Georgia were getting warmer and they couldn't live there anymore. So when the climate is warming, species have one of two options. They can move toward the poles, or they can move up in higher elevation. Well, here in western North Carolina, a lot of species moved up into the Appalachians, and that was their move to higher elevation. So as a consequence, we have a large number of what are called glacial relict species. These are species that have been widespread in lower elevations, but then as the glaciers receded, they moved up to higher elevations in the Appalachians. There are salamanders in this case, the spruce fir moss spider, the smallest member of the tarantula family, and the northern flying squirrel, which, if you look at its range in the image above, you can see this is a cool temperature species, right? Its habitat. It also lives up in Canada, up in New England, and then there's this isolated population here in western North Carolina. So we have seen these species moving in response to climate before. The problem is now, as the temperatures warm, where do these species go? Right? You look at the northern flying squirrel. It doesn't have, where it lives in the southern Appalachians is not connected to any higher mountain. So where's it going to go? So these glacial relic populations are imperiled by climate change. Now, when we think about these species migrating, right? So as the glaciers receded, these large mammals migrated to track their preferred temperatures. But how might it be harder for species to migrate now than it was 12,000, 15,000 years ago? Next time you're in a plane, take a look at the landscape. So if we think of forests as a natural landscape feature, we've fragmented that by, among other things, developing land for agricultural uses. So now, if you're a species that needs forested habitat, and you're trying to get from the little piece of forest in the foreground of this image to some of the forested hills in the background, and you're only going to follow forested land, that's going to be a tough trip, right? You're definitely not going to be able to follow a straight line. You're going to have to take a pretty circuitous path. So habitat fragmentation is likely to make these species' ability to migrate lessened as compared to what it was at the end of the last ice age. So I went to Nepal to investigate these issues with fishes. So this is Nepal. It's sometimes referred to the Himalayas are sometimes referred to as the third pole, and the reason for that is because there's the third most ice stored in these mountains behind the North Pole and the South Pole. Now that water, the water stored in these mountains are sometimes referred to as the water towers of Asia. There's about 1.5 billion people that live in the watersheds of the Himalayas. But there's almost 3 billion people that are connected to these watersheds by either being reliant on energy produced through hydropower projects on these rivers, or by eating foods that are grown using irrigation water diverted through these rivers, from these rivers. So it's a really important place to study and learn about how climate change might be affecting these ecosystems. So I did my research on the Kali Gandaki River. This is a picture of it way down in the valley. This is the deepest valley in the world. It's an amazing place. If you ever get the chance to visit Nepal or northern India, it's amazing. It's the trip of a lifetime, an incredible place to be. So if we look at the elevation of Nepal, it's a really, really interesting place. So the country is only about 125 miles across, but you go from a humid subtropical climate to the Tibetan Plateau, which is to some of the highest elevation places on the planet, or the highest elevation on the planet at Mount Everest, Sagarmatha. And so it'd be like driving from Asheville to Charlotte, or rather, driving from Charlotte to Asheville, and going from a humid subtropical climate to a glacier-covered mountain. I mean, so it's an incredible elevation gradient. And the river that I studied, you can see in the red rectangle here, you can see how it cuts through the Himalayas. So this river cut through the Himalayas as they were rising up. It doesn't flow out of the Himalayas. It arises in the Tibetan Plateau and then cuts across the Himalayas. Here's a Google Earth image of it. You can see it coming out of the high elevation and passing by these massive peaks, flowing through some hills, and then eventually finding its way onto the humid subtropical forest down there to the lower right. So just to show you the kind of fish that live here, this is a snow trout. I know I shared a picture of that with you earlier, but this is a different species of snow trout. This is what lives at the very highest elevations. You can look at that powerful tail, and you could say that this is a fish that lives in high flow velocities, is able to survive in some pretty challenging places. When we get down to the lowest elevation, there are a lot more species that can live there. And so we find a whole diversity of fishes there. This is a fish called the glassfish, Parambassus ranga, including freshwater pufferfish, which I think I shared with you before. You look at the body shape of that fish, and it's going to need to hide and be sheltered in vegetation and structure. It can't hold its position out in high flow velocities, of course. But when we saw these, it was amazing. We pulled them out of the net and they puffed up just like that. So we had to get them back in the water pretty soon. And these are what the terrain looks like. I apologize. I may have shared some of these images with y'all, but this is where we would travel to get to our sites, and pretty harsh conditions, pretty tough places to travel through. By the way, you can see how they build the roads here. If you see the piles of debris to the left side there on the river, you see how that's right down below this road that's been carved into the mountain there. So it's actually illegal to build roads in that way in the United States. You can't simply let the debris run down into the river valley, but in Nepal it is. So pretty tough terrain. Again, this is our Jeep on its way to one of our sites. Not for the faint of heart, for sure. Occasionally we'd have to deal with landslides. This is in kind of the mid-hills of the Kali Gandaki Basin, and so this is a student from Kathmandu University on the left who's got out of the Jeep, and we're waiting for them to clear up this road so that we can drive on by. And so they've got the equipment out here cleaning up this landslide, and we're hoping that that we can get out of here before another landslide happens. Got stuck in a few places. You know, this is kind of par for the course. Although this is the only time that our vehicle got stuck, so it's we got pretty fortunate, I think. This is us down in the lower elevation. This is in Chitwan National Park. We came out here. We visited some sites in the lower elevation, and I had some Army folks come and escort us because there are wild animals here that we wanted to be careful of. And on this this little beach, that was kind of cool. We saw these big paw prints. There are tigers that live in this national park, so that's my hand there to give you an idea of how big these prints are. And it was kind of cool. You know, you see these on the right. You see these larger prints next to a smaller set of prints. And I like to imagine that it was like a mom tiger and her cub coming out onto this mud flat to kind of check things out. How cool would it have been to see that, right? So we wanted to see what was happening to fishes. Since the 1990s, had they been essentially migrating up in elevation in response to climate change? And so we looked at a total of 26 species. And in the upper range, there really wasn't much change. 8 increased elevation, 13 decreased, 5 no change. Not much going on there. But when we looked at the lower range boundary, there were 14 species that increased in elevation, only 2 that decreased. So it looks like the lower bound of species ranges, they're really moving up to higher elevation. And so this is one species of snow trout on the left and a species of loach on the right. These 2 species each moved the lower boundary of their range up about 200 meters in elevation. So a pretty significant movement up the mountain from fishes. All right, so in addition to these migrations in response to changing climate, there has also been documented changes in what's called phenology. So as I mentioned, phenology refers to periodic plant and animal life cycle events. So this could be when the flowers bloom in the spring. It could be when the migratory birds leave in the fall or arrive in the spring, all these kinds of things. So these authors looked at a whole bunch of events in Wisconsin where they had data for from 1930 to the present. And there on the right, they plotted the occurrence of these events by Julian calendar day, right? So the Julian day is basically you take all the days in the year, with from January 1st being number 1 and December 31st being 365. And so when they plotted the day that these events took place against the data for each year, for several of these events, they found a negative slope of that line, so the first column on the left there, which tells you that those events were happening earlier, right? So for instance, Eastern Phoebe arrival was on the order of about 20 days earlier in 2000 than it had been in the 30s. But then there were also events that didn't seem to be changing. So arrival of the fox sparrow, arrival of the eastern towhee, those sorts of things were not trending significantly. So still data to be teased apart here, but it does look like in some cases there's been a change here. So I have to thank one of our students for sharing this article with me. Just a reminder, for extra credit, you can share 2 internet stories about the environment. Tell me a little bit about them, and you can get 10 points of extra credit. But these researchers have found that American robins are now migrating 10 days earlier than they were in 1994. So a change in the timing of events in nature is a second effect of climate change that we're seeing. I thought I'd end by sharing results from an experiment. When we lived out in Oklahoma, we got to know Rebecca Sherry and colleagues that were involved doing research on the tallgrass prairie and trying to get a handle on how warming climates would be affecting the plant communities, the phenology of them, when they were flowering, that kind of thing. So they used artificial heaters to experimentally heat patches of prairie about 4 degrees Celsius, and then see how that affected the flowering time of plants. This is what their experimental setup looked like. They were warming plots of the grassland, and then they had controls set up that were just the same way, but the heaters weren't turned on. So this is what they found. So we've got Julian day on the x-axis from Julian day 60, which is essentially the end of February, all the way up to Julian day 330, which is the end of November, right? And they looked at when each of these plant species flowered. So the genus of each of these species is given there in italics. And the red bar is the range of days that they flowered under warming conditions, the experimental warming. Green was the control, and then the blue diamonds there are the median. And so if you look at it for a little while, especially if you look at the median data, what do you see there? How does warming affect the time that these plants were blooming? Yeah, so what had happened was that plants that were blooming before the maximum temperature, right, essentially in July, that dotted line, those plants were now blooming earlier. Those diamonds and the red bars are shifted a little bit to the left. On the other hand, plants that flowered after the peak warming had occurred in the summer were now blooming later. So as a result, you start getting this gap in the middle, right, where there aren't any flowers blooming. Well, why might that be a problem? Yeah, well, one of the issues related to that, like this says, it delayed it for species after the peak. It made it happen faster for species before the peak. Is that a lot of these plants have a symbiosis with insects that pollinate them and feed on them. And so how will this affect the coevolution of these species? It's hard to say. So it's just like a lot of questions in climate change. We're not really sure how things are going to be affected, which is just one more reason that if we want to keep living the way that we have been, it's really important for us to deal with climate change mitigation as soon as we can. So to sum everything up then, there's really two effects that have been observed as far as climate change interacting with species go. The first is the poleward range expansion or the higher elevation range expansion, and the second are changes in phenology. All right, so our final lecture this semester tomorrow will be on energy, and I hope you all are doing well. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.